What happens when a rape victim teaches the feminist theory of rape culture in a university classroom? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo file. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Recently, a feminist sociology professor published an anonymous article in the online magazine Inside Higher Ed, which is a mainstream, seemingly pro-feminist news and opinion site about post-secondary education. The article, called Surviving Rape Apologists in the Classroom, tells us probably more than most of us want to know about how feminist convictions translate into extreme anti-male bias in the university classroom. I recommend that everyone read the full article, which is really remarkable, and I'll touch on a few points here. The article is essentially about how difficult it is to teach about rape to unrepentant rapists. Correct that. Unrepentant male students, but that's basically one and the same in this author's mind. It is disgusting and offensive to this professor that some male students disagree with her contentions about sexual violence. Some male students, for example, find it hard to accept that rape is really as widespread as feminist professors say it is, or that it should be as loosely defined as it is. Perhaps they're skeptical that a rape has occurred if a woman consumes alcohol before sex and then is said to have been incapable of giving her consent. I suspect that idea would get me, in the professor's elegant words, a fucking 0 if I wrote it on an assignment. But I'm jumping ahead, so let me back up. This article is immensely useful for what it shows about the incredible echo chamber that the feminist classroom has become, in which theories are presented not to be analyzed or tested, but to be accepted, and in which a professor can actually feel traumatized because a few students doubt the theories and want to argue about them. In the heady old days of interactive pedagogy, instructors used to feel wild with joy when students felt strongly enough about any subject to try to challenge the instructor. But this instructor doesn't want male students to question. They are to listen and believe. And at best, they may come to recognize themselves for the unknowing rapists they likely are. Yes, you heard that right. The instructor actually informs us that not only do some students in her class come to realize that they themselves have been raped. Isn't feminist consciousness raising a wonderful thing? Not only that, but sometimes, quote, students learn that they have actually perpetrated rape and struggle to reconcile that with their images of themselves as good people and not one of those usually guys. Imagine using classroom time for this, convincing female students that the sex they regretted that time they were on holiday last year was really a crime because they didn't give an explicit affirmative at every stage of the proceedings, and convincing male students that what they thought was a mutually enjoyable consensual relationship was really sexual assault. This is what sociologists get PhDs for nowadays and what they're paid six-figure salaries to do at university. Unfortunately, from the instructor's perspective, too few men are willing to accept their culpability. Some of them, surprisingly, resist her insistence that they're all rapists, or at least rape facilitators. As the instructor tells us, quote, many feminist instructors, especially those who are women, know all too well what it is like to navigate the mansplaining of a few men students who would like to ardently deny that rape culture exists, end quote. Mansplaining, that mocking little word invented by the advocates of equality. According to this professor, mansplaining is what men do when they fail to accept that masculinity is coercive and predatory. I wonder if she calls them mansplainers to their faces. I wonder if she pretends to herself and others that she doesn't harbor a deep-rooted dislike of men. In the article, she presents men's supposedly typical objections to her theory of rape culture, and I can't help but wonder if she has deliberately dumbed down those questions for inclusion in the article. You wouldn't want them to seem too acute. But even in the way she presents those questions, they're the kinds of objections that ordinary people might find reasonable. Questions about women's responsibility for their own safety, for example, or questions about feminist definitions. We can't tell from the article whether the professor deals with these questions in a professional manner. Maybe she does, but it's hard to imagine. I suspect she tells her students that asking questions in the first place makes them part of the rape culture that she's trying to enlighten them about. And she never seems to question what right she has in a supposedly secular university to demand that students accept her version of truth. The climax of the paper comes when the instructor reveals that she has herself been raped and that on a recent occasion when she had to grade an essay in which the student denied the feminist theory of rape, she had an emotional meltdown, which she tells us about in the clear expectation that we will all empathize. And it's worth saying that a fair number of the commentators on the article do empathize. She tells us that, quote, "As I went over his paper, I realized that I was reading a paper that sounded word for word like something the man who raped me would say. And not only did this sound like something my rapist would say, this student fit the same demographic profile as him, white college male between the ages of 18 and 22, end quote. Now, at first, it isn't clear what she means, whether she is telling us she was actually raped or whether she's just imagining what a rapist would say. Then once we're fairly sure she is referring to an actual rape, it seems possible at first that the instructor suspects that the student essay writer may be her actual rapist, but then we come to understand that she's experiencing a traumatic memory, and this is how she describes it. She says, quote, "I got up from my desk and went for a walk. I could not concentrate. I had plans to read a book later that afternoon, which were shattered by being thrown back," not the plans, her, I guess, "into a pit of traumatic, fragmented memories by this student's paper. I was furious at the fact that as an instructor I was expected to take his paper seriously and scared of what he might do if he did not like his grade. Although I knew it was unlikely that this student would literally try to rape me, his words felt so familiar that I began having trouble distinguishing him from the man that did. Their words were so frighteningly similar that the rational instructor side of my brain could not overpower the trauma survivor side," end quote. I can only guess that this professor has read a lot of trauma theory and that we're supposed to understand that her reaction is consistent with trauma, and perhaps it is. But she wrote this essay after the traumatic episode had passed, and what she presents here as a university teacher's statement about the difficulty of teaching resistant men is, in my opinion, outrageous. At the end of the essay, she expects to be congratulated that she summoned the courage to grade the student's paper. Perhaps we can assume that she no longer literally fears that the student is likely to rape her in revenge for a poor grade, but obviously she still does believe, or she wouldn't have written this article, that a man who objects to feminist theory can be logically linked to a man who rapes. Now forget the weirdness of her description, whether she means that the man who raped her actually argued with her about feminist theory during or after the alleged rape, or whether she was merely imagining what he might have said in his own defense if she had confronted him. It's not clear. I think it does say something about her inability to convey ideas in prose, but never mind. What is so remarkable is this idea, which I've never seen so baldly stated by an actual feminist in the classroom, that a man who gets angry at the feminist insistence that all men are potential rapists is a potential rapist, with his anger as the proof. This is the absurd and yet widely accepted circularity of feminist logic. I'm going to force men to sit and listen to me tell them that there is something in men in our present culture that makes rape not only a symbol, but also an all too likely outcome of all male-female relations. And if a man objects to that, if it fills him with rage at being so slandered, that just proves my point. And I've been raped, so don't you dare object to anything I'm saying. 0! The professor screams at her computer screen in an outburst of blind rage. You get a fucking 0. Well, this woman shouldn't be anywhere near university students, and she herself admits as much, at least indirectly, when she asserts that one of the most basic tasks of an instructor, to detach from the personal in order to be objective, is impossible for her. Quote, "How, I wondered, could I possibly evaluate the student's work in an unbiased fashion? Such a request would involve me living an entirely different life than the one that I have had." End quote. Feminist activists told us for years that this was the lie that men used against women who wanted professional careers, that women were too emotional to do the job properly, that they brought all their personal issues into their work in an inappropriate way. Now a feminist is telling us that this is the reality of women's lives and that we shouldn't expect professionalism from women. Well, I don't like the position I'm put in as a reader of this article, either to accept the author's contention that as a victim she can't be expected to do her job properly, or to admit that I'm a monster devoid of human empathy. And that's my point. There are places and situations where feeling is paramount, but the classroom definitely shouldn't be one. And when feminists insist that lived experience be placed at the center of academic instruction, this is exactly what results. Rape victims wanting to teach about rape in the classroom and unable to recognize what a catastrophically bad idea that is, not only for this instructor, but especially for all the other male students who will experience her irrational fury and hatred.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.